when Heidegger was trying to, what Heidegger's philosophical program essentially consisted of was the rediscovery of being. Now, he believed that prior to the ancient Greeks, who were quite rational and modern in their approach to the world, that people lived in a relationship with being that was much less mediated by interpretive structures, I suppose is one way of thinking about it. And he thought of being as something that was inframed. And the framing, which is also a term that I use, the framing restricts the manner in which being is able to manifest itself. So it's like a reduction of being to something specific. Now, it's pretty obvious, and Heidegger obviously knew this, that in order to interact with something, you have to simultaneously not interact with everything. So you have to reduce the phenomena to a pinpoint before you can actually interact with it in any immediately useful manner. But one of Heidegger's points was that that also restricts our ability to be in direct contact with being, and he thought of that as like the ground of meaning. Now, I think there's different sorts of meaning, and perhaps Heidegger did too. There's the meaning of the thing that reveals itself to you. And so that would be the meaning of an anomaly in some sense. And then there's the meaning of the framework that you use to interpret the situation. And then there's the meaning that you experience when you transform the framework that you use to look at things. And those are all forms of meaning, and they're all interrelated. But it has striking to me Heideggerian approach to this, because in some sense he was also reacting to Nietzsche's ideas about the death of God. It was an attempt to help people reorient themselves in the world in the novel historical situation where we had become detached in some ways from our traditional religious beliefs, which were in some sense a form of framing. You know, one of the things Jung said about religions, he said the purpose of a religion was to stop you from having religious experiences. And it's quite an interesting way of thinking about it, you know, because what Jung was claiming was that the purpose of a religious system was to filter the overwhelming power of being down to a point where you could tolerate conceptualizing it. But, you know, the price you paid for that was a certain kind of arbitrary limitation. Well, you're always paying the price for arbitrary limitation, but it would be nice if you could also transcend that from time to time and realize that there's meaning outside of the frameworks that you generally inhabit, and that you can narrow those frameworks so much that you don't get any of the revivifying form of meaning. And Jung would think of that when he was thinking about it symbolically. He would think about that as the absence of the water of life, for example, which is a very common motif in fairy tales. You know, the king is old and desperate and dying, and the only thing that will save him is the water of life. There's a great Grimm's Brother fairy tale that's called The Water of Life. It has exactly that theme. It's got a perfect mythological structure. Now, I think I showed you guys this last time. Is that correct? Do you recognize that? Okay. So that kind of summed up our discussion about the Dragon of Chaos. What I was trying to communicate, which I think is a very, very difficult thing, is that there are many different ways of conceptualizing the ground of being, and you can do it from an objective perspective, and that's a very useful tool, but I think that is a form of framing. It's not so much a description of the nature of being per se, and the being that we were speaking of, I think, is properly conceptualized, at least for some purposes, in relationship to this diagram, which says, well, being is a field of information from which you derive the common objects and entities that you interact with, but also from which you derive your own structure, your own experience, and your own mechanisms of framing. And so you can think of reality as that which allows for the derivation of those two things. And I also made the case to you that I think you can make a strong case that that's actually how your brain works. Like your brain acts like that's the way the world is. And then a secondary case that if that's how your brain acts, and you're a Darwinian, you're faced with quite a problem if you are attempting to make the claim that the objective world is the ultimate reality, because that isn't how your brain is set up, and at least in principle, it evolved so that you wouldn't die because of your foolish ideas, embodied or otherwise. Anyways, you can wrestle through that in your own minds. It's a very difficult thing to conceptualize. Now, one of the things that's characteristic of this particular diagram is that, and you've seen this in the book, this is a bit of an elaboration of the idea of what happens to you when you encounter anomaly. And what happens is, fundamentally, that your body prepares to do all manners of things. Some of those are negative, like they're experienced as negative emotions, because they're fundamentally defensive and protective. So they can involve pain and frustration and disappointment and shame and guilt and all of those sorts of things, as well as fear. But then the other side of that is, well, there's riches to be had when you encounter something novel, and so the parts of your mind that are associated with creative exploration and the reconfiguring of ideas should also be put on alert, and that is what seems to happen. So basically, your response to anomaly is to prepare to do everything. And that can be very exciting, it can be extremely compelling. So one of the things that I think is really worth thinking about, and this is something we'll cover a lot as the class comes to a halt, because this is one of the only optimistic ideas I've ever been able to derive from psychology that I actually think might be true. And it's a really optimistic idea. Like, if you accept the idea that it's reasonable to construe the ground of reality in this manner, and then you take seriously the two things, the fact of your embodied motivational and emotional response, that's one thing, and then the fact of the hierarchy of anomaly, so that some things are anomalous, in a kind of trivial manner, and then some things are anomalous in an absolutely terrifying manner. But, so if you accept that, you can draw a further inference, which is, well, maybe sometimes things are anomalous in an optimal manner. Now, and then I would say, well, what would define that optimality? Well, let's assume that there is a meaningful ground of reality, and then let's assume that there's a framing system that you have to use to deal with that, and that's partly biological, but it's also partly a consequence of enculturation. And then let's assume that that framing system can get outdated. So that's all associated with the stories that we've been talking about so far. So then let's assume that the fact that it can be outdated is also an existential problem. So it's a constant problem, so that not only do you need to have a framing system, but you need to have a mechanism that you can engage in to update the framing system optimally. And then we can take that one step further and say, that's built right into you. It's part of your nature, it's part of your biology, it's part of the structure of your consciousness. And then we could say, well, here's a hypothesis. What if that's what's happening when you get engaged with something? So imagine what your brain is trying to do, roughly speaking, is to situate you in relationship to being, so that you can both tolerate it, you can tolerate it, appreciate it, frame it, and stay on top of it. And that your mind has to be able to signal to you when you're doing that. And I think that's what happens when you're captured by something and you get engaged in it. Is what's happening is your mind is telling you, your experience is telling you, you're exactly situated in the right place. You're stable enough so you're not going to fall apart, but you're fluid enough so that you're not going to fall prey to excess stability. And then the experience of that is an experience of engaged meaning, but there are phenomena that are associated with that too, like it's easy to pay attention. It's just straightforward. It's easy to pay attention to things that you're engaged by. And I think that that's because your mind, roughly speaking, your brain, knows that information flow is maximized there. So you're not going to be terrified and you're not going to be bored. You're going to be engaged. You don't fall apart and you stay updated. And so the way you experience that is that the meaning is optimized under those conditions. You're deep into the material, so to speak. And it's meaningful. It's directly meaningful.